There's certain things Mushoku Tensei just can't adapt in the anime, and one of them was unfortunately RUDEUS' demonic circle of 6. This is just one of the many school life topics the anime brushes to the side, and it joins the likes of Rudy's nightlife and even some of his daily life. They're the subtle moments which bring this world to life, and they often expand the story beyond that of just Rudy's. This time it just so happens to be a shonen subplot happening in the background, and I figured some of you might be interested in hearing about it. Nanahoshi also had a major impact in this episode too, so as we look at that and the true extent of how it affected Rudy, hopefully you'll appreciate more this subtle piece while, we still have it. But first, Webnovel's back again to sponsor this video with yet another captivating story recommendation, this time with the steampunk isekai Lord of Mysteries. It's rather rare we come across an isekai that takes place in an alternate Victorian era, but let me tell you, the occult mixed with dreadnoughts, airships, and cannons isn't something I knew I needed in my life. So, as we follow our protagonist through this thoroughly fleshed out steampunk fantasy, he'll uncover all sorts of mysteries, all while gaining strange new powers in the process. It's hard to convey just how well developed such a story is, but for a series that includes everything from magic and history to the supernatural and thought-provoking mysteries, it's all approached with incredibly fascinating detail. The author was clearly well versed in the era his story takes place in, and it's more than evident with the number of amazing reviews it has. So, if you want to read this mystery-filled steampunk fantasy, or gain access to a collection of other stories like Solo Leveling and Eminence in Shadow, you can find thousands of amazing reads right here on Webnovel. Just click the link down in the description, download Webnovel, then search for Lord of Mysteries. Whether it be the books or the comics, they're all available using my link down below. Okay, episode 39, Afar, covering chapters 8 to 11 from volume 10 of the light novel. I know the anime's been pretty heavy with all the slice of life stuff lately, but you'd be surprised to know that there could have been a whole lot more. I mean, you may not notice it with the way the anime portrays it, but the passage of time has been rather quick lately. From when season 3 started to where we are now, it's been almost half a year and things have been relatively peaceful. Of course, the novel isn't going to write about each of those days in detail, but it did spend an entire chapter describing one of them. Then, even in this most recent episode with Nanahoshi, you wouldn't have been able to tell due to how quickly everything happened, but 2 months have passed since Rudy and Sylvie were married, another several days from when the letter came, a month after that for the incident with Nanahoshi, then even an entire week for when Nanahoshi was living at their house. 1 more week would be spent finally getting to the successful experiment, so in the span of 1 episode, this was 3.5 months that had gone by. It's a progression of time that I feel needs to be mentioned since it helps to make sense of why things happen so fast in the anime. Unless you were aware of the months that had passed, you'd probably think this all took place over a week or something. Now, to briefly mention some key events from that day in the life chapter, mornings were often spent training with Bodygotti. He would spectate or spar depending on the day, then occasionally join for breakfast and leave straight after. Rudy would then head to school to check up on Cliff and Zanaba, and it was both their research that we would get an update on. Cliff was in the middle of creating his own magical instrument, so if his theory was right, then it was very possible to create one capable of negating curses. As for what this theory entailed, it inferred that magical items and curses functioned the same. You see, if a curse placed on an object produced a magic item, and a curse placed on a person made them a cursed child, the fundamental properties of their origin seemed very similar. This made Cliff think that if something could be done about the effects of a magic item, then the same could be said for the effects of a curse. It was the basis behind his knowledge of magic circles in general, and a solid explanation for why he was so well versed in it later. Zanaba was doing his research on the doll, and the majority of that consisted of deciphering the journal they'd found. It was a lofty task he spent most of his day on, and this left Julie to do work on her own stuff. It had been 1 year since Julie was bought, and her progress with earth magic was actually quite astonishing. In fact, if she continued practicing with the daily lessons Rudy provided for her, then Rudy knew she'd be an expert at it in no time. This would mean that they could move on to the next phase of their plan, and that meant that they were 1 step closer to the mass production they were planning. Now, the next part of Rudy's day was lunch, then his advanced healing and intermediate detoxification classes. Nanahoshi's experiments were what came next, and it would always be tense as there was this looming sense of irritation and impatience. 6 months of magic circles were tested to no avail, so that meant it was time for her to move on to something different. Rudy would then go meet up with Sylvie, and it's here we get to the most important thing from this day in the life bit. Sylvie's schedule is unbelievably busy. Only once every 3 days does she get to spend the night at home, and that was only because Alina Lise offered to watch the princess for her. On the days she didn't, Sylvie would have to spend the night at school, and it was before that she would usually go and walk home first. She would finish class, go home and cook dinner, then do some cleaning, take a bath, and go back to school. This wouldn't be that bad if the house was close, but with the walk being 30 minutes at least, I'm sure 2 hours of travel each day would get rather tiring, especially with the school, work, and chores in between all that. Rudy of course felt the same, but Sylvie's response was that she liked doing all of that. It just made the time they did get to spend together even more special. So it was the nights she spent at home which were about as horny as you'd expect, and it eventually got to the point where Rudy felt guilty for it. He wanted to exercise self-control and not treat her like an object, but Sylvie's express permission would always convince him otherwise. Rudy knew he was weak and wanted to show respect, but at the same time this was everything he'd ever dreamed of. There was a whole list of things he wanted to do or have done to him, so whenever Sylvie would give him the go-ahead, he would just lose control and forget everything. So much so that he'd actually been able to complete half his list already. He obviously didn't do anything Sylvie didn't want him to do, but the lengths she went to make him happy were far greater than the lengths he went for her. It's the reason he felt the need to make it up to her, leading to their eventual deal to teach each other magic. This happens a bit later on in the episode though, so before that we first need to talk about the day the letter came. It was a morning unlike any other, and Rudy was lying in bed both horny and happy. The bliss of waking up next to someone like Sylvie made him wonder if this was what it was like to be truly happy. To him, this is what he felt life was worth living for. So, things had been relatively peaceful, and it was an amazing feeling knowing such a sensation would be experienced every 3 days now. There was one major thing that had happened though, and that's the shonen-esque sub-story happening within the university. You see, unbeknownst to Rudy and his relaxing home life, an image had built around him which he probably wouldn't agree with. This wasn't something he was aware of up until now, but somehow he'd become the boss of the school. He was the leader of the most fearsome group Renoa had ever known, and to all the students they had come to refer to them as this, Rudy's demonic circle of 6. It was a group very similar to the 4 Heavenly Kings, and their ranks consisted of exactly who you'd expect. The obvious were Zaniba, Cliff, Linnea, and Persena, then the not so obvious were Fitz and Bodigadi. All supposedly answered to Rudy, and all needed to be defeated if anyone wanted to get to him. So, if someone wanted to challenge Rudy for his control of the school, it was common knowledge now that they first needed to defeat the 6. A cursed child, a genius, a royal guard, 2 beast girls, and a demon king. Only then would they have the right to challenge Rudy, and that was an occurrence which Rudy hoped would never happen. I mean, if the person challenging him was strong enough to beat Bodigadi, then that was a separate problem all on its own. Obviously, no one ever got past the first challenge, and it was in cases like that that the person challenging would just end up becoming their subordinate. Like, there was this one first year who randomly became part of their group, and that was simply because Zaniba had annihilated him in a duel. It was a prideful newcomer who defeated all the other delinquents in his grade, so that naturally gave him the confidence to challenge Rudy. Given the rules of the school though, he first needed to defeat the 6, and that resulted in him challenging Zaniba first. It was a fight that started off closer than you may expect, but one that fizzled out as soon as the first year started running out of mana. All Zaniba had to do was hold out until then it was super easy to close the gap and knock him out. So that's how Rudy gained a new indirect subordinate, and it was all part of the territory of being the university's boss. This wasn't a power Rudy was necessarily unhappy with, since it made intervening with bullies super easy. All he had to do was tell them to stop, then immediately they would and run away. It was something he'd do even if he wasn't the boss, since as long as he lived, Rudy wouldn't allow anyone to harass the weak. It was a core belief that defined who he was in this new life. Now, it was later that day that Rudy would receive the letter, and it was in the novels that Paul's guilt would be expressed even more. He felt bad for missing Rudy's 15th birthday, and even more so by the fact he'd be missing Norn and Aisha's 10th. He also felt bad for offloading his sisters to Rudy, since not only did he ask Rudy to just take care of them, but he also requested he find a house and even enroll them into school. It was a job Paul knew he should be doing as their father, but one he couldn't since getting Zenith was important too. At the very least, he was confident he could handle that, and he assumed if all went well, he'd be back with her in a year or two. Norn and Aisha's circumstances would then be described in a little more detail, and it was Norn who Paul felt Rudy needed to look out for. Since she wasn't gifted the same way that him or Aisha was, it was only natural that she felt a bit isolated. Combine that with Paul spoiling her, making her a bit selfish, and there was no doubt that she would prove to be a bit difficult. This was the contents of what Paul wrote, and it essentially chalks up to Paul feeling bad about everything. In any case, the fact Paul needed him to buy a house made Rudy relieved in the fact that he had already bought one. The main concern with having Norn and Aisha live there, though, was the impact on their education that Rudy's nightlife would have on them. He figured he would have to put them in the rooms farthest away from his. Now, something I wish the anime included was Rudy's realization that he needed to ask Sylphie first. He knew being a good partner meant consulting on things together, so rather than just state Norn and Aisha were going to live with them, he instead went and asked for permission first. He would present Sylphie with the letter in the kitchen, then let her read it before saying anything. At first, she was a bit disappointed the news of their marriage hadn't yet reached him, but that expression quickly turned serious as soon as she was finished. It wasn't because the letter had mentioned anything particularly concerning, but it did remind Sylphie of her own parents. She was faced once again with the fact that they weren't around anymore, and the remembrance of that clearly showed via the concern on her face. Rudy would then apologize for being so insensitive, but Sylphie would reassure him by saying she had a new family now. There was no need for her to be unhappy, since being lonely wasn't something she needed to worry about anymore. It was this that made Rudy want to start a family with her even more now, and that brought up the question of whether they were even ready to have a kid. Rudy was sure things would be fine if they did, since if every other living thing was capable of having one, then there was no reason that he and Sylphie couldn't handle it either. Besides, with Paul planning to show up with Lilia and Zenith, there would be plenty of capable adults present to help raise his kids. This brings us now to Rudy and Sylphie's magic lessons, which, as we saw, went well for Sylphie, but not so much for Rudy. Sylphie was learning the fundamentals relatively quickly, while Rudy was making pretty much no progress at all. To give a bit more context on why that is, since healing magic required using your own mana to alter the flow of another person's mana, perhaps Rudy was just unable to envision that. Perhaps he couldn't conjure the feeling of someone else's mana interfering with his own, and perhaps that was the reason he couldn't silently heal or use any other type of support magic. As for Sylphie, disturb magic was something Rudy wanted her to keep a secret. He told her who it was he had learned it from, but didn't tell her how he almost died while doing so. So, out of fear that Orsted might not like the distribution of this magic, Rudy warned Sylphie not to teach it to anyone. The two would then compete in their magical tug-of-war game, and the winner would get to do in bed whatever they wanted to the loser. Rudy would then bring up the topic of having kids again, and this would turn the conversation horny for both of them. You're probably best not knowing the cringy stuff Rudy says after this, but the gist is that Rudy treats sex like an H game. Well, sometimes anyway. You can read the rest on screen here, but now I'm just gonna move on to the next part. It was 1 month after the letter that the incident with Nanahoshi would happen, but before we get to the breakdown itself, there's a bit more to be said about the theory of how all this works. Obviously, the bigger and more complex the object you try to summon, the more mana required to make it happen. This is the way the conservational laws of energy work in this world, and if it reigned true with this experiment here, the amount of energy being used for this would only result in a 1 meter teleportation incident. That is, if the experiment grew out of control anyway. Even if it somehow did through all of Nanahoshi's safety precautions, Rudy was certain he'd be able to find his way back anyway. He wasn't nearly as concerned about being teleported again as you might think he should be, even going so far as to joke about it. Nanahoshi would then go on to explain the principle behind her circle too, but because Rudy didn't understand it from his perspective, that meant we didn't get to either. So the experiment would start and fail just like how we saw in the anime, then Nanahoshi would erupt and have her breakdown. The anime only alluded to the idea of self-harm or worse, but the novel straight up confronts it and brings it to the forefront. It constantly parallels the mental state between her and Rudy's and clearly describes the impact that it has on him. The anime didn't do too great showing this in the infirmary, but the face we see here is the face he had then too. His lips were parched and breathing heavy, and Zeniba himself even stated how he'd never ever seen Rudy this flustered before. I think this would have done well to hammer home just how serious this situation was to Rudy, and it would have made clear how easily a reminder of his past could affect him. Another significant portion the anime left out with Rudy was the responsibility he displayed while taking care of Nanahoshi. You see, Sylvie had actually shown up to see what was happening here. She overheard students talking about Rudy carrying a girl, then rushed over to the infirmary to see what was happening. It was then that Rudy would ask if Nanahoshi could stay with them, which was a question Sylvie would respond to by asking why. Since to her, staying in the infirmary was probably better, Sylvie couldn't understand why Rudy would push for otherwise. This wasn't because she was suspicious Rudy would do anything, but was more so just because she didn't know how to handle Nanahoshi. So, if Nanahoshi really was going to stay with them, then Sylvie made it clear that she would be Rudy's responsibility. Now, it was on the way to the house that Rudy truly contemplated Nanahoshi's life, and it was while doing so that he understood how everything led up to this. You see, he could tell from carrying her just how light she was, and that made it clear that she wasn't eating enough. Her commitment to her work meant she probably didn't socialize, and if her only focus was to get back home, then the stress of not making progress was likely agonizing. It was all this that was constantly bubbling to the surface, and the breaking point was the recent failure killing 2 years of research. It was a fatal blow that had made her last 6 years worthless. The circumstances were definitely different from the trauma Rudy had been through in his own life, but the mental anguish was all the same for sure. If he had to compare it to something he went through himself though, a similar setback was the time he'd been banned from a video game. He'd spent several years no-lifing this one online game, only to one day get banned and lose everything. The entire day he wasn't able to process anything, and when he realized nothing he could do would get it back, the next month he had spent unmotivated to do anything. It was a learning experience in which Rudy vowed to never touch an online game again. Now, this definitely wasn't the same, but whether the pain from this or the trauma from his bullying, the depression which arose from it was something Rudy was all too familiar with. It had allowed him to relate to Nanahoshi on a far more personal level. This brings us to when Nanahoshi is finally at their house, and while the anime showed Sylvie to be the one to find the knife, it was actually Rudy since Sylvie wasn't even around for any of this. This presents a slightly different message from the anime, since by Rudy being the sole caretaker of Nanahoshi, it shows the level of responsibility he's willing to take to ensure she makes it through all this. It highlights the extent to which he resonates with what she's going through and shows a more empathetic side that we don't usually get to see. This is all because her pain reminded him of his own, and to see it all from beginning to end, well, it was hard not to see his old self in her. So, a whole week would go by with Nanahoshi staying at Rudy's, and aside from eating and sometimes showering, very little agency was being shown on her part. Her ambition was gone, and in its place, resignation. It was one day while Rudy was watching over her, though, that out of nowhere Nanahoshi would suddenly start talking again. She would describe the circuit board she was trying to create and lament over how no matter how much she changed the wiring, this one part just wouldn't connect to the rest. Brute force would only cause defects, and a patch in that defect would just create another defect. So, like a software engineer trying to debug their code, Nanahoshi would be stuck in an endless loop of non-stop bug fixing. She simply couldn't solve the problem of connecting this one circuit to another. Rudy would just listen silently as Nanahoshi said her piece, and that's when he would decide to bring the others in. It's a scene that I actually want to delve into more because of the theory in it, but one that'll unfortunately have to be in the next video. They kinda speed through the experiment's success and the party after, so that's something that I'll have to talk about later. If you enjoyed what you saw in this video though, then be sure to leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also come hang out on stream where I talk about the cut content early. Until then though, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!